record on this computer. There we go. So we're going to get back to talking about atomic matter. And if we get time, we'll start on the heat chapter, which I just finished editing. I took out about 40 slides out of the last year's lecture because they just weren't necessary. So the last thing we had really talked about was the idea of active versus passive insufficiency when it comes to muscle elasticity, right? And we talked about the fact that active insufficiency is where a muscle cannot, right, cannot contract any further. It cannot actively move any further. Whereas passive is where the muscle can't stretch any further. So where it can't lengthen any further, that's passive insufficiency. So we talked about that. Compression and tension we talked about briefly, right? Compression is where we squeeze things together. Tension is where we pull stuff apart. And we use that in physical therapy quite a bit for different reasons. Tension we talked about tension or traction we talked about using on the spine. Compression we talked about, you know, when you have a joint that's injured, we often put it on compression. You guys will learn when we talk about wound care, talking about the basics of injury repair, which would be RICE, right? Rest, ice, compression, elevation. Well, compression is one of those major things where if, say, I hurt my shoulder, one of the things usually the doc will do is sling it. And what that's doing is compressing that joint in there, giving it as much maximal contact as possible to help relieve pain. And we talked about shearing, which is where those two bones kind of move on each other in odd ways they shouldn't. Let me mute my phone before it beeps 50,000 times. I'm sure it's probably other students giving me their availability for later. We are muted. Okay, there we go. So shear, where things kind of grind on each other like this. Now that can happen in multiple ways. It can even happen, we talked about whiplash being an area where the bones kind of separate. It can also cause a shear. Those bones can shear on each other. When I injured my neck with patients, I had a shear force to my spine. The patient had grabbed a hold of my head and twisted. And what happened is those spinal vertebrae rotated and sheared on each other. And that's what caused a fracture on my neck and also ripping of a bunch of nerves as well. So we had seen this picture here. So now we're going to briefly talk about arches of the foot, right? How the arch provides that support for walking. Now we're going to talk about some properties of liquids, right? And why we talk about liquids. Where do we use liquids primarily? Let's talk about water in physical therapy. Well, we use it when we're doing aquatic therapy, right? And aquatic therapy is becoming more prevalent. It's a great low impact way of getting patients that are, you know, unable to do stuff on land back to function. The main reason we don't do it in some areas is because aquatic therapy is expensive. You know, there's the cost of owning a pool or a small therapy pool or whatever it may be. There's also the insurance costs. The insurance costs are absolutely stupidly ridiculous to have a pool in an actual therapy clinic. So when we have a liquid contained in a vessel, it's going to exert forces on the side of the vessel, right? There's going to be pressure. So when you get in the pool, right? You get in the pool, you can feel that pressure of that water around you. The pressure of the water around you is greater than the pressure in the air. Anything submerged in the liquid will feel that pressure, right? That's that osmotic property. We may absorb a little bit. And that's sometimes how your skin gets all pruny when you're in the water, right? Does anyone know what the term for that pruning is called? The medical term? For when your skin prunes? It's called maceration. I typed it in the chat just because I know somebody's going to say spell it. Maceration in the case of being in the, maybe the bathtub, the hot tub, the pool too long is an okay thing, right? But for older folks, that maceration can cause problems because if something like they get maceration between their toes or from wearing the same brief for too long, the skin becomes macerated and soft, and then it can rip and they can end up with an injury because of it, right? When we talk about the human joints, right, all the joints of the body, right, most of the joints have synovial fluid in them. That synovial fluid is contained in a capsule, and that capsule absorbs some fluid from the outside and lets some of that fluid off as the pressure increases and decreases. When we have an injury, so just like I said, I injured my shoulder. Let's say I was out somewhere and I fell and I landed on that shoulder. The shoulder itself is going to swell. Well, what's causing the swell is all the superficial vessels around that shoulder are going to gain excess fluid. Why are they gaining that excess fluid? Because it's going to limit my motion. And the body knows when injury occurs, limit motion to prevent further injury. And that's why that increased fluid happens, right? When you get in water yourself, those forces around you will cause pressure on your body. And you've heard the term before when you were growing up, right? You shouldn't swim within 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour after eating because you'll cramp. Well, not really, right? But what can happen though, and you'll find this when you do aquatic therapy, is some people, when they get in the pool, as soon as they get in the pool, the pressure of that water on their body causes their bodily systems to function, right? Where they suddenly either have to, go number one or number two, because their body suddenly has that exterior pressure pushing on their bowel and bladder, and it causes them to kind of void their bowels or their bladder. Hold on here. The secondary computer is freaking out, so I shut it down. So on a really small scale, the force of the water has notable effects on human physiology. It can reduce swelling as well, right? In that pressure in the pool, you can actually cause swelling of the body to go down. So when you have somebody that's got generalized lymphedema, where they have swelling pretty much throughout their whole body, if you put them in a pool, you can actually help reduce some of that swelling. The downside is that swelling has to go somewhere. And that swelling typically goes to the bladder, which means they usually have to go to the restroom again, right? So it pushes that fluid back to the heart filters it back out, it gets sent to the kidneys vacate it. This is why I explain sometimes why when you get in a pool, you have to go to the bathroom, or you get in a hot tub and you have to go to the bathroom. As you go deeper in water, pressure around the body or pressure around anything increases, right? That's why the fish that live in the deep, deep parts of the ocean are physiologically different than the fish that live in the shallow parts, or maybe in a lake or a river. We also have buoyancy as the effect, right? Buoyancy is the pressure against a submerged object that causes an upward force. Objects that are more dense or denser will sink. Objects that are less dense will float. When you get in water, the volume of water that's displaced with you is equal to the volume of you. So that's why if you fill your bathtub all the way to the top and then you get in it, the water's going to splash out of the sides because you have to take into account your own volume. Otherwise, you'll overflow the bathtub. Buoyancy can have a great effect on human beings, right? A person that is more muscular in nature and has more muscle and more dense bones or denser bones will sink more than a person who actually has a little bit more adipose, right? And we tend to float towards the direction of our most adipose. And most of our adipose is on the anterior surface of our bodies. That's why if we float, typically we can float on our backs very easily because the adipose is going to help us pull upwards. So we talked briefly about that Archimedes principle, right? The immersed object is buoyed upward a force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces. So the more fluid you displace, the greater the buoyancy of the object, right? That's why when you look at large container ships, right, their mass is spread out over a huge area. Why is that? Well, that's because if it displaces a large amount of water, it's buoyed or pushed up by a greater amount of water. And it's easier to float and easier to transport across the water that way. People with weak bones, osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bone disease, or have restrictions on how much weight they can actually weight bear in the water. Why is that? Well, because that buoyancy helps lift them up in the water. It takes weight bearing off those lower joints and can reduce the weights quite a bit. If you immerse somebody up to their throat, up to their Adam's apple, it actually will displace your body by about 90%. So stomach somewhere around 30%, chest about 50%. It varies obviously based upon the type of water, temperature of water and stuff like that. But if you have somebody that can't walk on land, like some of the kids that I have that have muscular dystrophy, they're completely unable to walk on land. The muscles have pretty much wasted to the point they can no longer walk on land. But if I put them in the pool, they can walk because they've reduced their body weight. Getting them in the pool can be fun, but once they get them in the pool, they're able to do a lot more of their exercise with less effort because of that effect of buoyancy and the operant of Archimedes' principle. And when we talked about density, of bones, that the easiest way to increase the density of your bones is by increasing weight bearing. So if somebody's stuck in a chair and can't weight bear on their legs, but we get them in the pool and they can start weight bearing, we can increase the density of their, their bones, their hips, especially their femur, which can improve other things as well, because we know that weight bearing through the femur increases its density, which also increases blood production, because a lot of our blood production is produced by our marrow. So in general, just getting a person up and walking can be a huge thing, even if it's just in a pool. So we got good old Pascal comes along now, right? And says that a change in pressure at any point in enclosed fluid is transmitted and undiminished to all points of the fluid. What does that mean? Increase in pressure at one end increases pressure throughout the system. You can think of it like a hose attached to your house, right? When you turn the spigot on at the house, there's an increased pressure right there at that hose. That is going to be transmitted throughout that whole hose and eventually come out the other end, especially if you have something like a sprinkler or something like that on. The more you open that spigot up and the more you allow the pressure of that water to flow through, the greater the pressure at the other end is, because it's going to spread equally throughout the system. Any break in the system will mean an escape of fluid, right? So if you cause a cut in one of your lines of your hose or something like that, it's going to escape in that area and it's going to reduce overall pressure. Dam breaks are examples of this. Leaky pipes, a leaky irrigation system can affect it. Well, in the human body, we can have a thing called a burst aneurysm or a hemorrhage, right? Hemorrhage is where an area of a blood vessel has suddenly just decided it's no longer patent and ruptures. If that rupture is large enough, it can dangerously drop the patient's blood pressure, right? And the body will then compensate for that. It's going to automatically, say you have a rupture in a major vessel, maybe you have a cut femoral artery. The body's going to detect that drop in pressure, so it's going to actively increase its blood pressure in order to help with that lack of pressure getting down to that leg. The downside to that is you've got a cut there or a rupture, you got a hemorrhage. So by increasing the pressure at the heart, you're going to increase pressure there, which is going to increase the loss of blood flow, which is why, when you have ruptures on certain vessels, it can be extremely lethal to a person, especially something like the femoral artery or one of the major arteries like the brachiocephalic or something to that effect, or worse, the aorta, right? When you have a rupture on one of those, it can lead to death quite quickly. So switching from liquids to gases, well, if liquids have a pressure, so do gases, right? Gases have atmospheric pressure. The Earth's atmosphere itself is like a giant ocean of air, right? With more pressure being on the bottom down where we are than being on the top. The higher up in the air you go, the less your pressure is. We don't feel the weight of the air around us because our bodies are pressurized inside. But if you went up, say, into the stratosphere, you could definitely feel the difference if you suddenly were outside in the stratosphere. I don't know how you end up in the stratosphere. Suddenly you're magically in that stratosphere, right? So that leads to the thought process for me is, all the superheroes that fly, when they get up and fly off into the air, they've got to have some sort of a compensating system in their body that decreases the pressure inside their body. Because if they don't, then their eyeballs are going to burst and they're going to have blood vessels that'll burst, right? A balloon filled with water is heavy in the air, but if you put it underwater, it doesn't feel that way. Same thing if lifting patients. Lifting a patient outside of the pool is pretty hard sometimes, but you put them in the pool and it's very easy to manipulate their body because you take away a lot of that pressure. You may feel that atmospheric pressure if you change from going down to the valley up to the top of a mountain or, something to that effect. And this is called altitude sickness. Especially in the military where they do high altitude training, a lot of times for the first couple of days somebody's in that high altitude, they're sick because they just can't adjust to that change in pressure. Or worse, if you're a diver and you've dived to deep depths and all of a sudden you shoot up and you get decompression sickness, or what they call the bends. It's always in almost every movie that they talk about when they have diving and stuff like that. Well, let's think about it. So Riley asked what kind of sickness would one experience from one or the other. So let's think about it. So if we change from an area of normal pressure, and we'll call normal pressure around the area we live, to an area of low pressure, well, our inside of our body is still operating at the normal pressure. So we're going to feel things like pressure behind the eyes, pressure in the skull. Nausea, definitely, right? Nausea is the body's way, and nausea is kind of that universal symptom. We feel that for everything. And what nausea really is the body saying something ain't right, right? And it's going to, why do we get nauseated? Because we're going to try to vomit out anything we have in the stomach. That's why we get nauseated, right? Why do we vomit stuff out in the stomach? Well, a lot of times when you think about it, when we experience nausea, it can be from illness. We'll rule that one out. But any other time we experience nausea, it's the body voiding an area that it doesn't feel is useful at that given time, right? Think about it. If you're being chased by a serial killer or, you know, Freddy or Jason, right? Your body's going to force itself to vomit because it's going to go into fight or flight. And what the body's saying at that given moment is, I don't need my stomach to work right now, but man, do I need my legs to work. And so it's going to void your stomach in order to allow you to move faster. It may void your stomach other ways as well, right? That may happen at higher altitudes. You may have problems with your bowel and bladder, right? Just because that pressure on the outside is a little different. It's nothing for those people that go to high altitudes to end up with UTIs because we require a certain pressure around us to tell us, you know, it's time to void our bladder. Well, if we decrease that pressure around us, we don't get that feeling, so we may retain fluid a little bit longer. If you come up from a depth to a shallow surface, well, your body's adapted to that depth a little easier. Our body seems to adapt to pressure, really higher pressure, a little easier than it does lower pressure. But suddenly we shoot from that deep depth to a normal pressure, your eyes can literally bulge out of the socket. Yeah, ears can pop, right? Ears a big one, right? And yeah, just going to something as simple as brine head. It's exactly right. I mean, just going to something as simple as Denver can really affect you and for a couple of days make you nauseated. I helped a friend move from Tucson to Denver. And I didn't really think much about it, but we got to Denver and man, I started feeling like crap. I felt like I was just generally flu-like. And what it was just the change in altitude, right? And on top of that, you know, you think about it, it's literally the worst thing you can possibly do to somebody is help them move to a higher altitude because now you're exerting your body and your body's just not used to that pressure and it can really affect you. You go to the mountain, go skiing. That's a big thing, right? Yeah, exactly. You go upstairs in Bryan Head and you're like, God, this sucks. Thank God for elevators, right? You're exerting your body and your body's not used to that exterior pressure that it's at, and the body's going to experience it in weird ways. So atmospheric pressure is measured in different methods, right? We have pascals, we have bars, we have ATs or ATMs, we have torrs, we have PSI. In the United States, we typically measure it in PSI just because we like pounds. I was watching a comedian the other day talk about it, and he said he went to Canada and was all confused by the metric system. And then he realized that the metric system is everywhere but the United States. And that was weird, right? A lot of when you get outside the United States are measured in pascals or bars, right? Any of you that ever, or like I said, because I'm into cars again, any of you that are ever interested in building turbocharged or supercharged cars, a lot of times you're going to have to worry about the pressure of your engine. And that's measured typically in bars or PSI again, if you're in the United States, which is weird. I prefer the bars. It makes more sense to me. Do you have to know all these units? No, they're there for your information. Don't freak out about that. Bryan Head's a ski resort. Sorry, it's just north of Las Vegas in Utah. Thank you. I was getting there. I was like, why did I draw a blank on what Utah was called? Because you taught it when you were there. So barometric pressure does affect humans, right? Fluids themselves compress less easily than gases, and we know this because if we fill a balloon full of air and we press it, the air is going to try to move around. If you fill a balloon full of water and you squeeze it, a lot of times it'll pop. Much of our body is filled with liquids, right? A good chunk of our body is water, and the areas that are filled with gases need to be filled with gases. The areas that need to be filled with liquids need to be filled with liquids, and those two should not intertwine. Right? Your lungs are meant to be filled with air. If you fill them with fluids, you drown. Your blood vessels are meant to be filled with fluid. If they're filled with air, you can die. So we need an equal composition of those, right? The lungs, the sinus cavities, the ear canals, the digestive system have some air in them. The blood itself transports gases, right, in oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen. But when it transports those gases, it transports them in contained containers like blood vessels or blood cells, right? So you go up in altitude, it affects your sinuses. That was one of the major things I felt in Denver, was it just felt like my sinuses were ready to explode. Your ears often pop, right? You get on a roller coaster, sometimes that can happen. Or you go outside of Vegas and you go to California and you go up through the pass. You'll feel it as you're going up and up. It feels like your ears are ready to pop. And so that can affect things, everyone a little differently. Some people get sick from it. Some people adjust really well and it doesn't affect them at all. Does that mean they're better at adjusting? It just means their body's better at adjusting. They really didn't do anything. So Boyle's law. Boyle's law, the only thing you have to know about this, you're not going to really have to calculate anything on this. Boyle's law says that if you measure the initial pressure versus the initial volume of something, it will equal the final pressure versus the final volume. Meaning that if you change the pressurization of something, the volume will adjust accordingly. If you squeeze a balloon, right? If you have a balloon filled with water, it's got a certain pressure. If you start squeezing that balloon, right, the pressure is going to go up inside of it. And what the balloon's going to try to do is increase its volume in order to compensate for that change in pressure. It does. Well, it can. Car sick's a little differently, Brooke. So Brooke asked if that affects car sick. Car sickness has more to do with the way the vestibular system works. And we'll talk about that in vestibular, because it's a really unique way that the brain works. But really, actually, now that I think about it, it is a pressure gradient difference, because it's the pressure gradient in the vestibular system, which is a fluid-based system. So really, yeah, actually getting car sick is related back to Archimedes Principle and all the principles of air pressure as well. Now that I think about it, I didn't really think that way. I think you make me think that way. But it definitely is, because it's the way the body reacts to the fluid in the inner ears changing. Good. I didn't think about that. Think about that a little more. So with Boyle's law, it says that if you change the pressure of a system in one way, either decreasing the pressure or increasing the pressure, afterwards, the pressure and the volume are going to be adjusted accordingly. So pressure 1, volume 1 is equal to pressure 2, volume 2. That's what I want you to know about it. Why is that important to the human body, right? Well, when you have something like blood vessels that are transporting nutrients, the blood and the nutrients are going to move across the cell membranes based upon Boyle's law. If we want to absorb more, the cell is actually going to either increase in size to increase the allowance for transfer of the nutrients, or if it wants to force it out, it will increase the pressure to kind of force that volume out of it. That's how that Boyle's law applies to humans, right? Tires are a great example of it. I'm sure that a lot of you right now, or not a lot of you, but probably a few of you, have gone out to your car and your low pressure light's on now on your car. Why is the low pressure light on your car right now? Yeah, it's cooler. The temperature changed, right? Mm-hmm. And when that temperature changes, right, we know that as it gets colder, the molecules move closer together, right? It's just easier for them to get closer together because they're not vibrating as much. And when they move closer together, the tires will kind of deflate a little bit, right? That means you need to add a little bit more air to have the same tire pressure there. That's essentially looking at Boyle's law in itself, right? Winds and storms are a great example of it, right? Well, usually if you listen to the weatherman, one of the things he reports on is the barometric pressure, the pressure of the air outside of us. So when the pressure goes up, certain things happen in the weather. Pressure goes down, certain things happen in the weather. It's the way storms kind of move across the United States, right? Why don't we see a lot of storms in this area? Well, typically we sit in an area of nice high pressure, and the storms just don't make it in here. Plus, we're surrounded by mountains that get all of our storms. It can be perfectly clear here in Vegas, and you go up to Mount Charleston, and it's snowing bananas up there, right? Or you go up to Bryant Head in Utah. All of that's based upon this kind of the pressure of the air in the area. Well, it makes sense. The higher you go up in that altitude, right, pressure is going to be less and less, and it also is going to be colder. That's why they get snow up there. By breathing in, we increase the volume of airspace in our thoracic cavity, right? Which is going to decrease the pressure in the lungs, right? Inspiration itself is an active process. We actively breathe in, we suck air in, but expiration, when we let that air out, is a passive process, because literally what you're doing is just letting the air kind of seep out of your body. The good news is you don't have to think about this. That's a huge bonus for most human beings, because if we had to think about breathing, a lot of us would be in trouble, because some of us can't chew bubblegum and walk. If we had to think about chewing bubblegum, walking, and breathing, we'd have lots of problems, right? So when we breathe in actively, breathing out is a passive motion. We may have to teach patients how to actively breathe out if they have some conditions like, COPD, or where they have residual lung volumes that are problematic. We may have to actively teach them to breathe out, whereas inspiration's active, they're going to have to teach them to breathe out actively. Sometimes that can be useful in patients that are having panic attacks, right? Getting them to, why do we have them focus on their breathing? Well, if we get them to focus on their breathing, we're causing active inspiration and expiration, and it takes their focus off so much of that panic. So plasma, this is probably one of the only types of matter that you pretty much won't deal with in physical therapy asterisk, right? Plasma is the fourth state of matter. We didn't learn about this in elementary school, if you think about it, right? When we learned in elementary school, we had solids, liquids, and gases. We didn't talk about plasmas. Plasma is an electrified gas. I have plasma going on behind me, right? That's what makes up most of our lighting nowadays. The atoms inside that gas are ionized, stripped of one or more electrons, right? And suddenly it lights up. The sun and stars have lots of plasma. That's what allows them to generate light. The aurora borealis and the aurora australis, right, the northern and southern lights, are glowing plasma in the upper atmosphere. If you've never gotten a chance to see them, I highly recommend it. Seeing the northern lights was something just awe-inspiring for the first time I saw it. What that is, right, is solar rays coming in, hitting those upper atmospheric gases and causing them to lose electrons. And it causes light, a beautiful light show, right? There are layers of low temperature plasma that encircle the whole Earth. It helps keep us kind of protected where we are. Occasionally, those showers of electrons come from outer space and enter the magnetic window, right? Crashing into those plasma and produce light, right? We get those beautiful light shows where stuff passes through the outer atmosphere. Fluorescence lights, neon signs. Here in Vegas, we use a lot of plasma, right? Now we've been converting to LEDs slowly because LEDs use a little bit less electricity, but they don't work on that much of a different principle than plasma, right? When you turn the lamp on, high voltage between the electrodes of the tube cause the electrons to flow. Those ionize the atoms, causes the light to show up, right? Based upon the type of gas we have in those lights will cause different colors. Right? Neon is an excellent example. Neon we can cause to change and form different, very vibrant colors. Right? There's that, I think it's called the Neon Museum or whatever, down on Fremont Street, where you can see all the old kind of Vegas signs that we used to have with just different colors. Argon gas reacts a little differently. You can even use some lead and mercury in certain gases to produce different types of lighting. And that's why if you go to Walmart or you go to Home Depot or you go to Ace Hardware, you'll be able to go there and get different colors of lighting. Now, some of that color of lighting is the actual glass on the outside. Some of it actually is the gas that's inside that light bulb, right? A lot of us, when we're kind of designing how our houses are, we want more of that true white light and less of that kind of yellowy incandescent light we think of when we were growing up, because it looks prettier, right? Also, it has a little bit more blue light radiation, which can cause damage to your eyes. That's why a lot of you, if you look at your phone now, it's a big thing a lot of the phone manufacturers have been pushing. How many of you guys now have a blue light filter on your phone that at night it changes the color of your phone? Yeah.
I do.
Yeah, right? It makes your phone look, what's it make it look? It makes it almost look yellowish, right?
Yeah. Or
Because
dark.
what it's doing is removing some of that blue light. When I take my glasses off, first of all, I can't see, but I can see colors at least. And when I look at my screen without my glasses on, my screen looks a lot whiter than it does when I put my glasses on. When I put my glasses on, because my glasses have a blue light filter on them, my screen becomes a little bit more, it almost looks like it's patinaed, right? Or kind of yellowed. And what that's doing is keeping some of those blue lights from striking my eyes. There's a lot of studies now that show excess screen usage leads to lack of sleep, because we translate that bright white light into meaning it's daytime. Right? If you try it once if you want to see if it works for you. Try cutting down your screen time after 6 o'clock and see if you don't sleep better. Right? And when I say screen time, I mean all screen time. That means video games, that means television, that means phone. Right? I hear a lot of people that'll say, well, I like to read before I go to bed. Well, what happened to books? Books don't let off light. I'm just saying, right? I know we are all used to the new electronic versions of stuff, right? Right. If I read a book, I'll fall asleep right now. Well, why is that? Well, you're not going to be getting that same irradiation as having, your iPad right in front of you. Oh yeah, there it is. Right. I've actually gotten used to now that I keep my, what they call the night light on my computer at all times. It's actually, I've just gotten used to it. Now, if I'm working on a game, I can't do that, because turning that night light on affects the way the colors in the game are. And that could really irritate somebody if suddenly their game looks all kind of murky because I decided to keep my night light on. People that buy video games are very, very picky, just to let you know. All right, so we got a bunch of review questions down here for you. We're going to stop that one. Let me change. I have not posted the heat lecture yet, so please bear with me. I literally just finished it probably 10 minutes ago, because I'm trying to cut out stuff that I don't think you guys necessarily need anymore. So we're going to talk about temperature and heat. We're going to get hot in here. All right. So I will post this. I promise I'll post it as soon as class is over. Temperature and heat. So we're going to talk about temperature as a scalar, talk about heat, and mainly talk about thermal equilibrium. That's the main thing that we need to kind of cover for human bodies, right? So temperature, we've talked about scalars and vectors. Temperature itself is a scalar. It just tells you how hot or cold it is. It doesn't tell you that it's getting hotter or getting colder. It just tells you where it is. If I say that, it's 60 degrees outside, that just is a number. It doesn't tell you it's 60 degrees warmer, right? Now that would be a vector, right? If I say it's 20 degrees warmer than yesterday, that would be a vector in temperature, because that's an increase in temperature. It's going up, right? But temperature itself is just a snapshot in time. That's why even when you take your body temperature, it tells you how you are at that given second. It doesn't tell you where you are 10 minutes from now. Your body temperature could be vastly different. And you felt that when you've gotten sick, right? Where your body temperature will go up and down because of you being sick, where you'll be sitting there 1 minute and you're literally just sweating bullets. And then because you're sweating bullets, that drastically drops your body temperature. And the next thing is you're sitting there and you're freezing and you're shivering, right? It's because of the way the body works with temperature. Almost all matter expands when temperature increases. And we'll talk about that, how water actually works differently. And then as temperature decreases, it contracts. A common thermometer measures it by expansion and contraction of liquids. We used to use mercury in thermometers, right? Well, why did we stop using mercury? Because we realized that mercury is not so great for the human body, and we're putting thermometers in kids' mouths, and kids like to bite. So they'd break a thermometer, that mercury would get in them, and they could get mercury poisoning. Typically now we use an alcohol-based solution, right? And that's typically in most thermometers is some form of an alcohol-based solution. But they had to change the way it was measured then, because mercury reacts differently to temperature changes versus alcohol versus water. So the most widely used temperature scale in the world is Celsius, right? And Celsius to me just makes sense. I don't know why here in the United States we have to use the stupid Fahrenheit scale. I'm going to say this again. Please just let us move to the metric scale. Because look at Celsius. 0 degrees is where water freezes. 100 degrees is where water boils. And it's divided into equal increments up from there of 1 degree. Whereas we have Fahrenheit, where what does water freeze at? 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's no even correlation when you look at it, right? Think about it from yourself. 90 degrees is hot. 110 degrees is significantly hotter. But that's a 20 degrees difference. In Celsius, right, 36 degrees is pretty warm. 38 degrees is significantly warmer because of that degree change. In research and science, we use Kelvin as our measurement. And Kelvin is the measurement of the transfer of heat, right? It's still separated into singles, just like Celsius. The major difference between Kelvin and Celsius is we don't call them degrees. In Kelvin, if something is 37 Kelvin, it is just 37 Kelvin. In Celsius, it would be 37 degrees Celsius. 0 in Kelvin is absolute 0. This is the point where all matter ceases motion, right? Could we survive at absolute 0, human beings? I'm probably going to see a lot, hopefully a lot of no's. Yeah, no, right? Heck, we get down into below 0 in Celsius and we start having problems. I remember being in northern Norway and it was minus 50 degrees Celsius. And that was ridiculously, stupidly cold. Like just when you walk outside, you know, you walk outside and you're like, nope, right? And your nerve endings literally tell you that because they'll eventually shut off in that cold a temperature, right? But at 0, nothing is 0 Kelvin, nothing is moving. That's all the way down to the molecular level. That means protons aren't exacting a pull on electrons anymore. The electrons are no longer circulating. That means everything just dies. There's a lot of theory that shows that maybe the closest we'll ever get to absolute 0 is black holes. We've gotten really, really close within a few hundredths of absolute 0, but we've not gotten, even in science, down to absolute 0. We don't know what happens when you get to absolute 0. Could be good things, could be bad things. We just don't know. I would be one of those people that suspect the closer we get to absolute 0, bad things start happening, right? So in temperature wise, Kelvin, because it's separated into single digits, just like Celsius is, it relates really well to it, right? 0 degrees Kelvin is minus 273 degrees Celsius. It makes for easy conversion. Not so easy for Fahrenheit, as we learned in math, right? Again, the comic book geek in me, this is where the comic book geek kind of comes out in me. In the DC universe, the fastest person in the DC universe is the Flash, right? Because he's supposed to be able to get his body to vibrate at higher speeds than can be humanly possible, obviously. His worst enemy is Captain Cold, who calls himself the master of absolute 0. That would make sense. If the Flash is the fastest person in the world and you've got an enemy that can reach absolute 0, that would be the exact polar opposites. See what I did there? Polar opposites of each other. So just kind of my geeking out there a little bit. So temperature is related to the motion of molecules in a substance, right? In an ideal gas, temperature is proportional to the average kinetic energy of translational or motional motion, right? Stuff moving. Temperature is not a measure of the total kinetic energy of a molecule, though, right? So it's not the total kinetic energy that a substance has, but it's more about the relative kinetic energy it has. If we take boiling water and we have 2 liters of boiling water, it will have twice as much kinetic energy as 1 liter because the volume is different. The temperatures, though, are going to be the same, right? If we have 2 liters of water at 100 degrees Celsius boiling, and we have 1 liter at 100 degrees Celsius, they both have the same temperature, but that 2 liters has twice as much kinetic energy because of the volume of it. So heat is kind of what we think about. What's hot? It's hot in here. It's not so hot, right? We got to turn on the heat when it's cold. Right? We're more warming up the area, but we'll leave it the way it is. When 2 substances of different temperature are in thermal contact, heat will flow from the higher temperature surface to the lower temperature surface, right? If you get up in the morning and you have tile floor like I have, and it's been really cold out, and you put your feet down on that floor, man, you get the shivers, right? Because what's happening is that tile floor is literally leaching the heat out of your body, right? It's going to take some of that heat and draw it out of your body because it's going to try to make you in thermal contact with it so that they become equal in temperature. If you touch a hot stove, right? Energy is going to enter your hand from that hot stove and transmit to your cooler hand. Cold toilet's the worst. Exactly. That's probably the worst feeling anyone can get. I would be willing to bet, especially if it's like, if you've ever had to use a porta potty somewhere where it's freezing, that's not fun. Right. That would be really bad. Literally like pull a Christmas Story where your butt freezes to the toilet. But when you think about it, if you touch a hot stove and there was no thermal exchange, you'd be able to keep your hand on that stove. Getting out of the shower in the winter, yeah, right? Why? Well, again, why does that happen? Well, when you're in the shower, right, you turn on hot water. So that hot water has a different thermal gradient than you have, right? If you figure your body is, let's 37 degrees Celsius, your water is going to be 38, 39 degrees Celsius, because that's how you would feel it being warm. Eventually, though, when you're in that shower, what happens to that temperature of the water to you?
You get used to it.
Yeah, you get used to it, right? What that really means is your bodies have entered thermal equilibrium. So your skin temperature actually is about equal to what the temperature of the water is. And so that's usually when you go, oh, okay, that's getting a little cold. Let me turn the hot water up. Now, it can also be that you're losing hot water. Your hot water heater is not putting out as much hot water now, and it is actually getting colder, right? But typically, when you're first in the shower, it's because you got used to it. That temperature is kind of normalized, so you turn it up a little bit more. Now you shut the water off, right? And you've got that nice steam around you, and you open that shower door. Now all that steam escapes right out of the shower, right? And it mixes with the cold air outside the shower, and all of a sudden, the air is cold around you. Well, now what's happening is your body is literally leaching heat out into the air around you. And so the air is stealing that stuff around you, right? You go up into the mountains and you get stuck up on the side of a mountain. One of the major things you're going to want to try to do is conserve body heat, right? And if you leave your skin exposed to air, the air is going to leach that heat off your body. So what do you put on? You put on more layers, right? To the point of, you go back to like the Christmas Story type idea, because it's getting closer and closer to Christmas, right? The kids were in those big kind of moon suits that they couldn't move at all in because it was keeping them warm. What happens if you're on the side of the mountain and one of you're up there with 3 people and one of the person starts going into hypothermia, where their body temperature is dropping rapidly? How can you increase their body temperature? Anyone have any ideas? Well, you could build a fire, obviously, but let's say you don't have the ability to build a fire.
You're supposed to slowly warm them up, right? Like, you know, layers.
Well, yeah, right. So you can slowly, if it gets bad enough though, right, you may actually have to get skin on skin contact with that person. Why? How are you trying to warm them up? You're trying to warm them up by donating your own body temperature. If you have layers on and kind of huddle around them, really doesn't do much, because your layers are keeping your heat in, their layers are keeping their cold in, right? The only way you're going to get a official transfer is skin on skin to actually get transferred. You can blow on them, right? Yeah, heat up the area around them. And there are some gloves that I just saw, I think it was last year or whatever. There's some really cool gloves I saw with a kind of a valve here in the wrist. And you can pop that valve open and blow into the glove. Oh, somebody said they saw them. Yeah, better not to have clothes on, well, to a point, because you'll eventually lose body heat too. What's best to do is not to have clothes on, be in close contact with each other, and then be wrapped around in something to keep the heat in, right? That's kind of the best way. Having no clothes at all is bad too. That could cause you to freeze, right? And there's some great stories. There was just a whole story about some hikers in the Caucasus Mountains where they were suffering from hypothermia and they were starting to die, and they actually stripped off all their clothes. And they found them like a few hundred meters away from camp, completely stark naked and frozen to death. Well, that was because of the body's way it reacts to cold temperatures, but that's a story for another class when we talk about how the body reacts to hypothermia. But when you touch ice, right? So say you touch an ice sculpture with your hands. Your hand is warmer than an ice sculpture. So it's going to transfer heat from your hand into that ice sculpture, and that ice sculpture is going to melt. That's why if you see somebody building ice sculptures, one of the things that's usually around it says, do not touch, right? Wet paint. Excuse me. Why do we say don't touch wet paint? Is it because we don't want to get paint on our hands? Well, that might be part of it. We might not want to ruin it. But literally, one of the reasons why you don't touch wet paint is if you touch the wet paint, you're going to transfer heat to that wet paint. And that's going to do is cause it longer to dry. Plus, put your fingerprints and everything else in it, right? Concrete, another example, right? Concrete needs a certain amount of time to set where it comes to a thermal equilibrium with the air. So the direction of spontaneous energy transfer is always warmer to cooler. Spontaneous meaning just happens, right? Right now, I've got the door closed, the room here. The room when I came in here was a certain temperature. Now the room has changed temperature. Does anyone have an idea why it's gotten warmer in this room?
Because of your body.
My body heat, right? My computer is putting off a good bit of heat. I've got a gaming computer, so that puts off for those of you that don't know, computer, exactly, right? My computer's a gaming computer. It puts off a good bit of heat. I joke that in the winter, I don't even have to turn my heat on. I can just turn my computer on and leave it on 24/7, and it warms pretty much the whole house. And I'm not actually joking about that. It does get pretty warm, right? My body heat's leaching off. I'm leaching off some of my body heat into the air, and that's warming the air up. Where is it going to be the warmest in this room? That's okay. We'll forgive your grammar mistakes. We're not in Dr. Sokel's class right now. Okay. The light bulb's going to be warm, right? Is it going to be higher up or lower down?
Higher up.
Higher up, right? We know that heat rises. It has tendency to move towards top of the room. So if I was able to put a thermometer up in the top of my room, it's going to be warmer than it would be down towards the ground. Well, why is that? Well, guess what the ground's doing to the air? It's leaching some of the heat, right? It's saying, "Oh, that's nice and warm. I'm going to suck it in," right? Same idea of getting out of that cold shower. If you actually get out of that, or the hot shower, you open the hot shower up, the steam comes out, the tile around your shower usually is going to be warmer. But as you step further and further away from that shower, the tile's colder. For heat to go from cold to hot, it requires an input of energy. There are reasons to do that, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the laws of thermodynamics, why we might want that to happen, right? Why we might want to leach out more. Why might we want to leach out heat? So suck heat away from something. Do we do that on a regular basis in Vegas? Yeah. Air conditioning. Right? Air conditioning is nothing more than taking heat, right? It is exactly why air is warmer upstairs than downstairs. It's one of the reasons why whenever I have an apartment, I want to be the downstairs apartment. Because the downstairs apartment's always going to be a cooler apartment, right? Because heat rises. The other thing about that is during winter, then my neighbors don't have to pay as much in electricity as I do, right? Because a lot of my heat is going to leach out and go up into their apartment, which my heat never turns on anyway, so it sucks to be them. Just saying. Other than my computer, the heat never goes on. I'm from Pennsylvania. This is like, we rate things on when it's time to put those short sleeve shirts away. I don't turn the heat on ever in Vegas winters. I can't even, you know what? No, let me rephrase. In 2011, when it snowed and it was 32 degrees out, I did turn the heat on long enough just to warm the apartment up just a little bit. And I think I took it from like 50 to 55. I was happy with that. It's on 79. Right now in my house, I want to say it's about 60 in my house, and I am absolutely in heaven. I can deal with this. I don't deal with heat very well. I don't know why I moved to Vegas. I moved to Vegas for my ex-wife, but that's beside the point. Yeah, like a lot of you are like, you would never survive. Wait till you guys have to sit in my classroom. Just wait. Yes, it's 60 degrees in my house. I can guarantee you that. It's a little warmer in here now because of teaching. Yeah, there's a lot of people that say that. I'm the reason why a lot of you guys will have sweatshirts. I'm just saying. I openly admit that. But what I tell you guys is I am preparing you to work in the hospital, right? And it's actually true. Why do we keep the temperatures in hospitals cooler? What does that help with?
Bacteria.
Bacteria and viral growth, right? The other thing is, and you think about it, if heat rises and cold sinks, right? Bacteria is going to try to migrate to the area of the warmest temperature. So it's going to be moving up. And usually hospitals have pretty high vaulted ceilings, don't they? So the most bacterial ridden area would be the air up towards the top, where they'll have a lot of their HVAC, which is just sucking it right out of the air then. There is a reason for the design of hospitals. We keep that cold for a reason. We keep the vents where they are for a reason. So it's all kind of designed by those beautiful, fantastic mechanical engineers that I could never do the stuff they do. But once heat is transferred, it ceases to be heat and is just a temperature. Meaning that once I put my hands on my desk here and I bring the desk to the same temperature that my hands are, we're not talking about heating the surface anymore. We're now just keeping it at a temperature, right? So if you're boiling water, once you bring it to 100 degrees, we're no longer talking about transferring heat. We're now just talking about keeping it warm. Same idea with your food at Thanksgiving, right? Once you cook the food, you'll probably keep it in something to keep it warm. Usually tinfoil over the food or something to keep the irradiation of heat inside. So when we talk about energy resulting from heat flow, we're talking about heat. Temperature, we're talking about just measuring the snapshot in time, right? In scientific terms, we call the temperature of our body internal energy. How much energy do those cells have, right? So when heat flows from me to this desk, what I'm doing is I'm donating my internal energy to the desk. When I'm touching it, I'm in thermal contact with that desk. Hot packs and cold packs are a great example of thermal contact in the physical therapy world, right? A hot pack we're going to put on a patient to warm their localized tissue up versus a cold pack, we're doing the exact opposite. We're trying to steal their internal temperature, right? And we have different reasons why to do that, from an acute injury to a chronic injury. But what's funny is when you talk about hot packs or cold packs, they both have a similar effect on the human body. They both relieve pain. Well, why does it relieve pain? Well, because it changes the body's feeling of that area. You get a different sensation. Very similar to if you bump your head, the first thing you do is you rub it, right? The reason you're rubbing your head is you're giving the body a different sensation so it stops focusing on the area of pain. The way my dad raised me, he did that in an extreme form, right? If my shoulder hurt, he'd stomp on my foot and tell me, shoulder doesn't hurt as much now, does it? Same principle. It really is, just not as nice. You're gonna find out I grew up kind of rough. Again, I said heat will not flow from a substance with more total molecular energy to a substance with less. It just kind of goes from hot to cold. Oh, I got a comment here. Like hot showers and cold showers. Yeah, exactly, right? And there are reasons why, if you watch the NFL, a lot of times after, or even NBA or whatever, a lot of times after their games, they're immersed in a cold tank, right? What they're trying to do is suck some of that heat off and relieve some of that pain in their body so maybe they can walk home. When we look at things, we have a large bowl of warm water versus a thumbtack that's heated up, that's red hot. There's more molecular energy in that bowl of water, despite that thumbtack being hotter, because there's larger volume of material there. If you take that tack and you stick it in the water, they're going to eventually become in thermal contact. The heat's going to leave the tack, and the bowl and that tack will eventually reach thermal equilibrium, where they're the same temperature. The greater the gradients in temperature change, the faster that transfer occurs. How many of you ever heard it's easier to make ice out of hot water? Has anyone ever heard that?
Well, I used to work in a bar where they would boil the water so the ice was crystal clear.
Yep, exactly. The other thing is, it actually does, there is some science behind that water actually getting to ice quicker, because you have a much greater temperature gradient from 0 degrees to 100 than, say, 50 to 0, right? And so it's going to give off its energy a lot quicker. It'll form ice quicker. We look at a whole cool lake. It has a lot more energy, even though it may be cold, versus that hot tack, because of that volume of liquid. So when we put a thermometer in contact with the substance, the heat is going to flow from that substance to the thermometer. Let's say that we put a thermometer in a nearly freezing bottle of water. At that point, the actual temperature is going to flow from the thermometer into that bottle of water, right? Because the bottle of water is going to leach some of that off. So when you put an oral thermometer in your mouth, initially it feels cold to the touch, right? But as it goes on, you cease feeling that because as that contact occurs, your body is physically warming up that thermometer. This is why if you ever have kids, one of the things they'll try to do is either hold some hot water in their mouth or rinse their mouth out with hot water before you take their temperature so they can stay home from school. Or maybe that was just me when I was growing up, not sure. Or they'll stick the thermometer under hot water and like, oh, look, you have a temperature of 160 degrees. I think you've got problems. Drink most coffee. Exactly, right? There are ways you got around, especially if you knew you had a test coming up, there are ways you could get out of school with a high temperature. That would work too, actually. Max says to take out a blow dryer in my armpit. That's fantastic. Never would have thought of that, actually. But after those objects are in contact with each other for a long period of time, they become in thermal equilibrium, right? If I get up now from my chair and somebody else came and sat in my chair, there's a good chance, because my body temperature runs warmer, that they're going to feel like this chair is warm to them. Because what I've done is the longer I've sat in this chair, my bottom and that chair have come into thermal contact and they've reached thermal equilibrium. There's no heat flowing from my butt to the chair at this point. They're both at an equal temperature. If I stand up now, the air is going to rush into where I was and it's going to leach some of that heat off, which is why if I sit back in a little bit, it'll feel cool to the touch. This is why we talk about the cooler side of the pillow, right? The cooler side of the pillow is the one that we're not touching. So you flip it over and you've got a nice cool side. But then maybe you're smart, or maybe you think you're cool and I'm going to get one of those cool memory foam pillows. And you get that memory foam pillow and it's so nice and cool until you start getting warm. And then like, I'm going to flip the pillow over, and you flip the pillow over and the other side's just the same temperature. Well, why is that? Well, it's because memory foam's really good at dispersing the heat throughout that whole object. That's why you have two. Exactly, Riley, right? You have the cold pillow and you have the warm pillow. That works out well. So if you just stuck a thermometer in a kid's mouth and instantly pulled it out, it wouldn't tell you anything about the kid, right? It would tell you about the air around, but not the kid. That's why you've got to let that temperature sit there until they equate out to each other when they become in thermal equilibrium. But also you have to be careful that the thermometer is not too large, right? If you take a horse thermometer and try to measure a kid's temperature with it, you may not get an accurate reading because that thermometer is not designed for what you're measuring it for, right? An ear thermometer should not be used to measure somebody's oral temperature because totally different orifices they go in, right? But why is it that oral thermometers and rectal thermometers are interchangeable? Well, it's because the temperature in those cavities are about equal, right? The temperature inside your mouth is about the same temperature as it is in your rectum. Both of those are a more accurate measurement of your body temperature, and actually rectum's a little bit more accurate than it is by measuring somebody's ear or measuring their forehead with one of those swipey thermometers, right? Well, what happens is those swipey thermometers know there's a temperature difference between your forehead and the thermometer, and it adjusts for that temperature. So let's say we add flame to heat a liter of water up and we raise it by 2 degrees Celsius. We have 1 liter, we raise it by 2 degrees. If we raise 2 liters by that same temperature, right, it's going to require twice as much energy to go up, or it's only going to heat half as much because there's twice the volume. So the more liquid we need to raise up in temperature, the more energy we're going to use, right? This is why if you're cooking, it's better to heat up just the amount of water you need for cooking versus heating up excess because you waste energy that way. The inside of your freezer or the inside of your refrigerator, the more packed it is, the more stuff you have in it, the easier it is to keep at that temperature than it is if you're just chilling the air constantly. Because those objects can take on that coolness and they can actually help keep everything else in that freezer cold. Which is why if you ever have an electric outage, what do they tell you not to do? Don't open the fridge, right? Because if you open the fridge, you've changed the internal temperature of it and your stuff can melt or get warm, right? No one likes like warm orange juice or anything like that. So when a substance takes in or gives off heat, the internal energy is going to change, right? So translational energy is going to change. There's going to be different energy in other forms as well. This is why we warm patients up, right? This is why when you go to the gym, it's better for you to warm up than work out cold, right? Because you're actually increasing your internal energy. You're increasing the rotational kinetic energy of the molecules in your body. So you're making it easier for them to move apart, and we're getting those muscles a little bit more elongated because you've heated up. Remember we said things tend to lengthen or increase in size when they're heated up. So when we talk about the total energy inside of an object, we're going to talk about its internal energy, right? We're not talking about specific heat because heat is a transfer of energy, but just that internal energy that we have. The measurement of internal energy in the scientific world is going to be measured in Kelvin. Right? That's that measurement of how much heat we have inside our body. Absorbed heat may make the molecules of substance vibrate faster. And in some cases, when ice is melting, a substance absorbs heat without an increase in temperature. So the substance then changes phase, right? When you have ice and you put it in a warm environment, it changes phase from a solid to a liquid. Theoretically, if we added enough energy to that water, we could actually make it into a plasma. If we heated it up, if we added enough internal energy to it that it would become separated, where those ions were separating off and those electrons were freely flowing. So the amount of energy that can be transferred depends upon the mass of the substance. This is why it takes longer to heat up a large house than it does a small apartment. You know, if you really wanted to be energy efficient and you're worrying about the environment, you'd be really thinking about how much space do I need in my house? And how much can I minimize down, right? Those silly small houses you see on Discovery or Home Gardens television, where they have those really tiny houses that everything's kind of compact in there. The tiny homes, yeah, right? Those tiny homes are actually really energy efficient. They're really energy efficient because there's not a lot of space in them that you have to change temperature. That means your air conditioner could theoretically be smaller. What would happen if you have a huge mansion and you try to cool it with an air conditioner in the window? Would it work out well? Well, maybe for that room that window's in, but for the rest of the house, not so much, right? You need a larger change in temperature in order for that to happen. Same thing with heat. If you have a little space heater, right? One of those little electronic space heaters, don't have any nearby, I'd grab one. That's used to heat up a room. It's really nice to heat up that room, but once you get outside that room, it's not made to heat up a whole house. They're just designed for a certain amount of surface area. So then heat, the measurement of heat is the heat energy transfer from one substance to another. When a substance absorbs heat, the temperature change depends on more than just the mass of the substance. It also depends on what it's made of. Right? Certain substances are going to heat up faster than others. So that unit that we use to measure the heat that an object can absorb or not absorb, we're going to talk about, is a calorie, right? A calorie is defined as the amount of heat required to raise 1 gram of that substance by 1 degree Celsius. In the case of this, we're going to talk about water, right? The calorie is defined as 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That's the specific heat of water. We use that to define all of our food as calories, right? The kilocalorie is kind of what we're used to seeing. Even though we don't think about it, all of our food is measured in kilocalories. The heat required to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Well, why do we measure in kilocalories? Well, say, I'm drinking Coke Zero, so that doesn't have any calories in it. But I had orange juice earlier. And my orange juice had, I think, 32 calories, because it was one of those cheapy orange zeros, or the low-calorie orange juices, which don't taste right. But it had like 32 calories per cup. It would be different if I looked at that and it was like, you have 32,000 calories per cup of orange juice. We don't like big numbers. Our human brains don't like them. So we came up with this idea of we're going to measure everything on kilocalories to make us feel better as human beings, right? And typically we distinguish the kilocalories from smaller calories by making your calories a capital C. So, you know, if you eat something that's got a candy bar that's got 500 calories, literally that candy bar actually has 500,000 calories in it. But we measure everything on the kilocalories, because I guarantee you look at a candy bar that's 500,000 calories, you're going to go, yeah, I don't need that candy bar. Right? Maybe we should measure back in the regular calories. Maybe it would help us with our diets, because, you know, something about eating something that's only got 75 calories doesn't seem as bad as eating something that's got 75,000 calories. And maybe we need to switch, right? Well, how do we know how much calories each food actually has? Well, they burn it, right? So, you know, you get a serving of cornflakes. How do they know how much calories in that cornflakes? Well, they actually burn it and see how much heat is given off. And then that, based on the heat that's given off, they can actually determine how much calories is in that food. Even something like wood or cardboard actually has calories, believe it or not. So even, you know, even though you hear it's like I've heard before, celery is a 0-calorie food. Not technically. Celery still has calories. It just means that your body is going to actually burn more eating it than it would gain by it gains by eating it, right? So a calorie itself, when we look at the terms of energy, 1 calorie is equal to 4.186 joules. It's a lot easier to think of a calorie as 4 joules than as 4.186, right? So 1 calorie equals about 4 joules. So that just kind of points you in the idea of when we're talking about joules back with energy, how this kind of works out where we're at now. So which will raise temperature more, adding 1 calorie or 4.186 joules of energy to something? Well, they're both the same. Right? This is like asking which is longer, a mile track or a 1.6 kilometer track. They're the same quantity, just expressed in different units, right? Which is going faster, 75 miles per hour or, 100 kilometers. Well, they're about the same because, again, they're just measurements in different units. So that leads to the topic of specific heat. It's the capacity of a substance to store heat depends upon its chemical composition. Some foods remain hotter than others. Right? Filling of a hot apple pie. Anyone ever get an apple pie at McDonald's or somewhere like that? You know, the ones that they deep fry? And you're able to hold it and you're like, oh, this is nice. And then you bite into it. Right? And you bite into it and all of a sudden that filling comes rushing out on your tongue and you melt your tongue. Well, that's because the crust has a different specific heat than the pie itself, right? The filling of the pie. Different substances have different capacities for storing heat. A pot of water on a stove might require 15 minutes to heat up. Whereas if you have an equal mass of iron, pizza rolls, yes, right? I always joke that Hot Pockets have 2 temperatures, either still frozen or thermonuclear meltdown. Those are the only 2 temperatures Hot Pockets come in. Same thing with pizza rolls, right? The Totino's pizza rolls. They only come in still frozen or thermonuclear meltdown. I'm not sure that they actually serve them in any other format. Right? If I heat up iron, it may take less time, right? Or it may take only 2 minutes for silver to heat up. And the material requires different amounts of specific heat to raise its temperature. The specific heat capacity material is the quantity required to raise 1 gram by 1 degree. And we know that a calorie is measured off of the specific heat of water. So these are some specific heats of different surfaces, right? We have water, we have aluminum, we have clay. This is why, if at the end of the day, let's say it's kind of fallout, but you still have the sun beating down on your pool all day long. If you get in your pool, the pool will still feel warm, despite the air around maybe feeling cool. That's because air has a different specific heat than water, and water kind of maintains that heat a little bit better. If you go to the beach, right? The beach may feel nice and cool while the water feels very warm. It's because the water has maintained that heat a little bit better, right? Now, what happens, and I learned this the hard way, I went to Costa Rica, where now instead of being on nice white sandy beaches, I had a black volcanic beach, and I thought I was going to go running on the beach later in the afternoon. I learned a lesson, right? Because we know that darker colors absorb heat better. Well, it also means it keeps the heat a little bit better as well. And I thought, I'll take my shoes off and go for a run. That was a big mistake. Don't ever run on a black sandy beach in the middle of the day. Not a good idea. My feet hated me for a couple hours after that, right? Because there's different specific heat of that beach versus in a traditional white sandy beach. Why do we like white sandy beaches? Well, because they look pretty, first of all, right? But also when you get out of the water, they feel nice and cool. It's literally the kind of thought process between like sandy beaches, because we think they're pretty and then keep things cooler. So inertia is the term in mechanics to signify the resistance of an object. Specific heat's kind of the same idea here. So specific heat is kind of the thermal inertia, since it signifies the amount of resistance an object has to change its temperature. A gram of water requires 1 calorie to change temperature, right? But it only takes about 1/8 as much energy to raise the temperature of iron by the same amount. So we'll end on a joke here. What's the molecular form of water? Well, it's HIJK-LMNO. You may ask why? Well, because the formula for water is H2O. I got a few jokes. There's a few more in this. I threw a couple more jokes in to keep you guys in attention. All right, so I'm going to